Welcome, everybody. Today, we will be talking about a more active regulatory environment that we're expecting to see under new SEC Chair Gary Gensler, specifically in the areas of cybersecurity, privacy, and ESG. We have a great and experienced speaker lineup for you today for today's topics. I would like to introduce Christian Kelly, Chief Technology Officer at Xantrion, which provides cybersecurity and IT support services to help protect firms from cyber attacks and help them be prepared for SEC and FINRA exams. Thank you, Christian, for speaking today, and thank you very much to Xantrion for being an associate member of the IAA and for sponsoring today's webinar. Next, we have Marina Taskova. Marina is Head of Privacy and Cybersecurity at Armanino LLP, an audit, tax, and consulting firm. Marina specializes in complex privacy and cybersecurity matters. And finally, I'd like to welcome Sean Wilkie from Grayline, which specializes in governance, risk, and compliance services. Grayline also offers outsourced CFO, accounting, and operational support to the investment management industry through its GCM advisory division. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here today. So let's begin with a discussion of cybersecurity. Ransomware attacks continue to make headlines, as many of us can attest by seeing long lines at the gas stations last week. Christian, what are your tips for protecting organizations against ransomware attacks?
Yes, that's a great question. It's definitely something that's top of mind, especially with everything in the news, as you said. We have dealt with companies who have had various forms of ransomware attacks or other types of breaches where financial loss is part of it. And we feel that having a layered security approach is really the first step. A lot of times people will look for some silver bullet, some fancy kind of shiny new box that will protect them, and not saying that these different types of technologies don't play a part, but having a strong foundation of security and a layered security approach is what we have seen be most effective in warding off these types of attacks. We look at, we take special care around, authentication, really understanding the full authentication and kind of identity of users as being kind of a primary way of, making sure that we can understand who's logging into what, and understanding anomalies around those types of attacks. Endpoint security continues to be a primary focus in thwarting these types of attacks, having good endpoint protection, having good control of the devices that the users are interacting with, and obviously end user training is a big piece of it. We see a lot of times basic things being skipped, and maybe companies going after something that, again, it's not that those types of technologies can't help, but if you miss or kind of overlook basic security controls, it can really come back to bite you. So really looking at your whole security program, making sure it's holistic, making sure you're not missing any basic protections is something that we definitely look at. Moving to backups, obviously that is a big, it comes in heavily when you're talking about a ransomware attack. So having good air-gapped backups is something that I can't stress enough. A lot of these ransomware attacks, the attacker gains some kind of persistent access to the network and takes time to understand what backup systems are in place. And in most cases, will go after those backups and delete those backups. And so having something that, picture yourself being an administrator on the backup server, can you fully delete the backups, right? That's the question you need to ask yourself. Are you going to have a copy of backups that is completely immune to anything that an attacker might do on the system? So that's something you want to take into account and really understand. Are you backing up all of your systems? We see that a lot as well, where a backup policy might be put into place and it's not audited or reviewed. So when push comes to shove, maybe some systems weren't included in backups, or the backups were failing or corrupt in some way, and that impacts the client greatly. Reviewing your cyber insurance security policy is something we're really starting to see insurance companies get very specific, where they're starting to call out ransomware insurance as a secondary kind of auxiliary agreement. I think that insurance companies are paying out a lot of ransoms now, and they're starting to try to understand and figure out how they can get away from having to pay that insurance. So we're starting, in the last few months, we've started to see very specific questionnaires about what exactly companies are doing. What type of access end users have to their own systems. Are they administrators? How many global admins are there in your network? Are there any users with global admin permissions? Like very specific questions, where typically insurance questionnaires were more, do you have endpoint protection, or do you have backups? They're starting to get very specific. And then obviously, to answer those questions, you have to be very careful that you don't kind of overextend kind of a hopeful yes, like, yes, we kind of are doing that, so we're going to put a yes. You want to be very careful in, if you're not completely fulfilling what they're asking, to put a no, because in the end, if you put a yes and it turns out that that was the vector for attack, that they're going to point to that and likely not pay out the insurance claim. So keep an eye on those insurance policies as they come in, as they start getting renewed, and likely you're going to start seeing changes in those. And then finally, have solid operational processes in place. We've seen examples very recently, actually, where a client might have very good security controls, breach detection capability, multi-factor everywhere, legacy protocols disabled, all of the things that you would expect. But because of some kind of lax operational policies with onboarding users, for example, reusing passwords, even if MFA is in place, reusing passwords can create a vector for an attacker to get in early into the process, maybe even before the user is fully onboarded, and gain multi-factor access, things like that. So having really good operational policies in place that mesh with your security policies is something that we see as vitally important into protecting.
Great, thanks, Christian. And another cyber incident that has been in the news recently was the Microsoft Exchange mass hack. Can you explain a little bit about what that involved, and what are your tips for responding to an incident like that?
Absolutely. So this was, within the last few months, there was a vulnerability in Exchange servers, email servers, which there's a lot of, and it was a vulnerability that was being targeted to very specific companies. But once Microsoft released the patch and made that patch available, within hours, mass scans were going on and attacks were taking place. So it's kind of an accelerated timeline to what we normally see, but it was an example of, if you're going to continue to have on-premise services exposed to the internet, things like Exchange, you really have to have a solid and rapid patch program in place. And I don't know, I think we can move to the next slide if anyone's able to do that. Yeah, so having a good patch management strategy where you can react quickly is vitally important if you're going to keep servers on-prem. The better kind of forward-looking solution is to continue to move to native cloud services. In the example of the Exchange attack, Office 365 was not impacted. So that was an example of, clients who had already kind of made that move were essentially protected from that attack. So again, if there's a reason why you still need to have on-premise services that you're in control of, you really have to have a good patching strategy where you can react very quickly to these types of vulnerabilities that come out. One kind of side note to that is beware of hybrid deployments. We saw a lot of cases where clients had moved to the cloud, for example, with Exchange, right, Office 365, but still had hybrid servers. And even though those hybrid servers didn't need to be exposed to the internet, in a lot of cases they were, due to legacy firewall rules or whatever. So we had we saw examples of clients who weren't even there was no reason for that server to be online, attacked, and malware be installed. I mean, thankfully it didn't escalate to a full like ransomware attack or anything that had a lot of impact. But again, try to reduce your attack surface when you move to the cloud. Another example of this is where clients move to Azure AD, which is a great authentication kind of system, but in some cases, in the same kind of context, an on-premise, what's called an ADFS server, a kind of a federation server, is still online, and that's a vector for very advanced attacks. Some of the SolarWinds kind of attacks, obviously came in through the SolarWinds channel, but then used ADFS servers to escalate up and gain more permissions and actually attack Office 365. So be very aware of, moving to cloud service is great. It definitely can increase your protection, but don't leave the legacy servers involved any longer than you absolutely have to.
Speaking of SolarWinds, what lessons can be learned from what happened there in terms of working with a managed service provider regarding due diligence on their supply chain? And Megan, we're on the next slide.
Absolutely. So the SolarWinds attack chain was a very interesting one. It's a difficult, this type of attack is difficult, obviously, to fully be able to suss out as you look at vendors that you're working with, right? But what is important is that you have a clear vendor due diligence process included in your security plan. You want to have a documented understanding of when you must or should do a vendor due diligence exercise, right? It's not all vendors are created equal. A lot of times in your security policy, you'll have different levels of data, right? Different levels of importance, of criticality, of privacy, and it's only when a vendor might interact with a certain level of your data that you would require a vendor due diligence package. So definitely have a good understanding of when you must do a vendor due diligence process, and then when you do them, we're starting to see more interest around the software development lifecycle, how that vendor might be interacting with other vendors in the kind of supply chain of what they're using to create their software, what kind of security processes and programs they have in place to protect themselves. Obviously, as vendors have other vendors and those vendors have vendors, it's almost impossible to fully suss out if something's safe, but it's worth the effort to understand kind of the security profile of the vendor, how seriously they take it. There are some, basics, do they have some kind of attestation you can look at, some kind of, SOC controls or something in place that you can actually review and kind of understand something that's audited and real. One thing we see with a lot of SaaS-based vendors, especially more startup SaaS-based vendors, is they will, when we start pressing them for information about their programs and their security, they will try to pass on, Azure or AWS's, Amazon's kind of security SOC attestation and say, hey, we're on Amazon or AWS, so therefore we're secure. It's very important to understand the operator, right? So of course, the platform, if it's on AWS or Azure, is likely going to tick any box that you could imagine. But the one who's on, the vendor that's operating it, that's a different story. So you really want to zero in on the operator and their security controls, whether they require multi-factor, what their patching procedures look like, what their vendor due diligence process is for their upstream providers. That's really where you want to focus, less about the platform that it's on, especially if it's on one of the big three. So that's something definitely to focus on. And then finally, it's not going to be possible to rule out all supply chain attacks. It's not possible for Microsoft. It's not possible for any massive company with unlimited budget to fully suss out every vendor and every vendor's vendor and fully understand if something's safe. So, as long as you have a program in place, as long as you're doing your due diligence and understanding the vendors and whether they're taking security seriously and can kind of come back with some kind of matrix of risk versus the product that you want to use, we see that as being a good strategy.
Excellent, some great tips there. So let's switch gears a little bit now and talk about some data privacy developments. And Marina, I'll come to you. Can you tell us what is happening on the state data privacy law front?
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you everyone for joining. It's an honor to be here. There is a lot of things going on in the field of privacy. I'm sure you heard a lot about privacy. The media lately is very active with respect to privacy in the United States, but also globally. This is a very brief, I would say, chart that shows you what's happening in the United States in terms of recent privacy development. There are multiple laws that are either active or already passed, or laws that are in process to pass. As you can see, introduced bills. There are also failed bills about privacy in relation to privacy. Just to give a little note before that, GDPR, which is the European Data Protection Regulation that has been adopted in Europe, is one reason for this significant shift in the privacy developments around the world. The adoption of that law led to adoption of multiple privacy laws around the world. And United States stayed aside for a little while, but then afterwards CCPA came, which is the California privacy law, which took the example of the General Data Protection Regulation and kind of initiated this process of multiple legislative changes in the field of privacy. What's mattered the most, and I'm going to mention it today, is California and Virginia. As you can see, these are passed bills. Other laws that are active are in Connecticut, Alaska, Colorado, Nevada, New Jersey. There are also failed bills, for example, those in South Carolina, Oklahoma, Arizona, Maryland, or North Dakota. Happy to continue with the next slide.
Sure. So of great interest to our members is what's happening at the states that are really leading the charge for data privacy law. So what's happening in California and some other states that we should be aware of?
Yeah, one thing that it's worth mentioning in relation to all these multiple state laws, as you will see, there's so many different laws and they're in such a different level of development. It would be a very difficult task for a company that it's located either in California or in Texas or in any other state to actually cope with these laws if the organization has global operations. It's also a bit difficult for companies to assess, is that a Virginia resident, is that a California resident, because most of these laws are very local. So I believe by taking into consideration the current developments and what happened in Europe with multiple countries in European Union and different approach towards privacy, is that there would be a federal privacy law. And I believe in Congress, industry, civil society, and the White House have all taken steps towards the creation of a US federal privacy law. Whether that's going to happen soon and how this law would look like, these are still very much in question, but it looks like that a federal law in the United States will appear. So just bear in mind that there is such possibility. I will speak today about laws which are important simply because they're already, some of them are operative and others would become operative very shortly. One of them is the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA. It is operative since January 1st, 2020, enforced till July 1st, 2020. But there would be another, we call it CCPA number 2, California Privacy Rights Act, which would be operative from January 2023. This law basically became real in November 2020 elections. And part of that law is already kind of active because, for example, they're creating now data protection agency, something very interesting, which also follows the European approach of the general data protection regulation. Just to mention that in Europe, every country has data protection authorities, which kind of enforce the requirements of the European privacy law. And of course, we also have Virginia Consumer Data Protection Act that is operating from January 1st, 2023 as well. In other words, in the upcoming 2 years, there would be a lot of developments in the field of privacy, which I believe would impact everyone. You will see huge increase of data protection officer roles, chief privacy officer roles, and even some type of connection between privacy and security, because a lot of the security matters for which Christian talked earlier would have an impact also on privacy, for example, in relation to data breaches, notification of data breaches, if these data breaches, to which extent they impact personal information involved, etc.
And I know our audience is probably curious about whether there are any exemptions to these laws that might cover SEC registered investment advisors. So can you tell us what the latest is there?
Yes, I would love to, if we can move to the next slide, just for visual understanding. First of all, guys, I am very sorry because the letters are quite small, but this is just for your information purposes if you want in the future to go back and double check these definitions. As you will see, I specifically underlined GLBA, which is the Ground Leaf Blue Act. The reason for that is because there's certain exception which concern the GLBA and also the HIPAA for healthcare organizations, which exclude certain type of personal data from the scope of these laws. For example, Virginia Consumer Data Protection Act is quite broad, and it excludes financial institutions or data subjects subject to Title V of the GLBA. However, this is not the case with the CCPA, and the CCPA doesn't exempt financial institutions or financial services businesses. However, it exempts certain types of information that is subject to the GLBA. Also, bear in mind that even though a lot of big part of the audience are financial institutions or financial services companies, just so you know, I'm pretty sure you are processing, and when I say process, I mean use, access, disclose, share, transfer personal information that doesn't necessarily relate to the services that you are providing. One example for that I could provide is marketing data lists, which you could obtain, or for example, personal information about individuals that you obtain prior to an application process, or personal information that you obtain from non-financial partners.
And Marina, I think a lot of people studied the CCPA when it first came out and got familiar with it. But then the CPRA came out, and maybe you can help us understand what is different about that. What is going to change once it becomes effective at the beginning of 2023? Next slide.
Yeah. Yes, of course. Thank you so much for this. I am focused on the CCPA, on the CPRA, because I believe they're more relevant for the audience today rather than the Virginia law. Bear in mind, Virginia law, and I will continue with the both laws here, are very much follows the European General Data Protection Regulation law. And in relation to California Consumer Privacy Act and California Privacy Rights Act, the situation is very similar. There is a few changes in relation to scope, which organizations will fall within the scope now in comparison to organizations that will fall in scope in the future. As you can see, for example, businesses, which is basically the entity that looks towards this idea, whether it's in scope or not, if it has gross annual revenues in excess of $25 million, or buys, receives, sells, or shares personal information of 50,000 or more consumers, households, or devices, by the way, includes also devices, could be part of the scope of the CCPA. Situation changes with the California Privacy Rights Act, they became a little bit more generous. So they're talking about gross revenues in excess of 25 million in the preceding calendar year. And they're talking about 100,000 or more consumers or households devices are already excluded. There's also another thing that we should mention, that, for example, the business derives 50% or more of its annual revenues from selling consumer personal information. As you can see, there is a slight difference in the California Privacy Rights Act, which talks about derives 50% or more of its annual revenues from selling or sharing consumer personal information. And when I talk about sharing, I quite a lot refer to advertising. There is also interesting difference in terms of consumer rights. Consumer rights are also introduced in the Virginia privacy law. One thing worth mentioning is the current rights of the individual, for example, to know what personal information is collected about this individual. All these rights, and again, I would like to repeat, are following the approach of the European General Data Protection Regulation of the European law. This is where this is coming from. Another law that also follows such approach is HIPAA, for example, for the rights of the individual. So where is the data of the individual? What you're doing with this data? How is it collected? Where is it disclosed? Are things that are important and are taken into consideration both by California Consumer Privacy Act and also by the California Privacy Rights Act, CPRA. Another right that is essential is the right to access the personal information. This is the right of the individual to be able to see what personal information you have or you store about this individual, and including maybe to ask you about a copy of this personal information, which you should provide. Another right is the right to know if personal information is sold and the right to opt out of such sale. These continue to exist. However, with the CPRA, there is also additional requirement, which is the right to know what personal information is sold or shared and with whom, as well as the right to opt out of such sharing. Again, this refers a lot to advertising. The current law has the right to delete. It has the right to data portability. Data portability is a very interesting concept, which has been introduced by, again, European data protection law of personal information to be transferred from one entity to another entity upon request of the individual. You will see that there are new right that appears in the CPRA, which is the right to correct data, which is if my data is not accurate, I want this data to be changed. It also contains the right to data portability, and it also includes the right to limit the use and disclosure of sensitive personal information. Sensitive personal information is, again, a rather new concept for California, but not so new concept worldwide. Sensitive personal data exists a lot globally as a concept, which is certain personal information that has higher sensitivity in terms of how it's used, what it's done with it, where is it shared, how it is protected, and how it is disclosed. One just very brief example is our health data. But there are many other, there is a lot of other data included into this concept. If we could move to the next slide. So I would like to continue with more changes. As I already mentioned in the previous slide about sale versus share, you can see that there is additional requirements of providing link on the web page that enables the consumers for their data not to be sold or shared. This is actually quite important, and also limit the use of the sensitive personal information. So there are additional restrictions to the sensitive personal information that I mentioned that basically enables the consumer to limit the use or the disclosure of his personal information that could present higher sensitivity. And another topic that I believe is very important is the enforcement. It's very good that we have laws, but question is whether they are enforced and to which extent they are enforced. Globally, there is a lot of enforcement going on lately. Huge fines are around the globe. Here, currently CCPA is quite generous and provides 30 days to cure alleged non-compliance before being considered as a violation of the law. However, this no longer exists with the new law CPRA. They do not give a 30-day grace period for amendments related to minors. Another thing that it's important is the administrative enforcement, for which I mentioned in the beginning of this discussion, which is the creation of the California Privacy Protection Agency for enforcement and guidance. This is a significant change. In the United States, again, the data protection agencies have significant impact on, first of all, compliance with the laws in general, and also enforcement, including data subject rights to a significant extent around the globe, or in relation to data breaches as well around the globe. So having a California Privacy Protection Agency that can look after how the California Consumer Privacy Act and CPRA is, you comply with it. I think that it's extremely interesting fact that I should mention. Otherwise, in terms of private right of action, basically any consumer whose non-encrypted or non-redacted personal information is subject to unauthorized access, theft, or disclosure as a result of the business violation of the duty to implement and maintain reasonable security procedures and practices may bring a civil action. There is a slight difference in the new law, which I want to mention. They also add email addresses with combination with a password or security question, and answer that would permit access to the account is subject to unauthorized access and exfiltration. So there are slight changes. There are more changes, which I will mention a bit later. For example, the introduction of security audits or review of the privacy practices of the organization, which are under the CPRA. And that's why security is so important and so much connected to privacy. And we have this discussion today. Thank you, Laura.
So Marina, we have the GDPR, the CCPA, soon to have the CPRA, and as we saw from your map, many active and introduced bills could potentially rise to the level of passed and therefore effective laws. So what is the best approach that you can advise companies that are trying to comply with all these different types of state and other types of data privacy laws?
Thank you so much. If we move to the next slide, you will see a few tips that I would like to mention today. First of all, I fully agree with Laura. There is a lot of companies with global presence, or even if it's not global presence, even if it's US focused presence, it is still complex because of these multiple local privacy laws. One thing that I believe every company should start thinking about compliance with privacy is to focus on where is currently the data. It is very difficult to respond to a data subject request if you don't know where the data of that individual actually is. There is a very huge risk for properly handling a data breach or any type of security incident if you don't know where the data actually is and who could potentially access it. And this is where the data inventory and mapping comes, and it's extremely important way for you to verify where is currently the data. And also, this data inventory is not a static document. This is something, either a document or a tool, both exist on the market, but data inventory and mapping is extremely important to verify where is the data going, and if there are any changes in your business practices, how these changes reflect the use of personal information and the storage of personal information and the access granted to this personal information. So data inventory and mapping is definitely a global activity, something that can be done. Also, rules can be created after the data inventory, let's say in the headquarters, has been performed, of how the subsidiaries abroad, if any, should handle that personal information. Another thing that is worth mentioning is uniform policies, processes, and procedures. If we could unify what currently is in place, and there is no patchwork on the basis of each law, and there are many things that could be unified, in terms of process in privacy, I strongly recommend that such a uniform approach is considered by the companies. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to track and monitor compliance with these policies is one thing. And also it would be very difficult to understand the local requirements. One, for example, example that I can give here is vendors. There are many different vendors, and maybe there should be some kind of a risk-based approach where, depending on to which extent such vendor has access to personal information, is to create a risk type questionnaires that are different for low risk versus high risk. So let's say vendors who are low risk don't have to comply with 300 questions, but vendors that are high risk, have to review 300 questions. I think that this could facilitate the process of onboarding of a vendor. And if you have these tiers of vendors, maybe it will be easier for you to track compliance for privacy and cybersecurity as well. Another thing that I would like to mention is the uniform approach towards third parties, which I just discussed, and uniform training. Training looks a very simple task, but I believe the training is essential for compliance, both with privacy and cybersecurity. I believe Christian would confirm training is extremely important. If we don't have training, it is very difficult to educate the staff specifically of how they can handle personal information globally. And very often part of the reason for non-compliance is internal, not necessarily coming from third parties. Very important thing that I wanted to mention is the frameworks to monitor privacy and security practices. As you can see, you have CCPA, you have CPRA, you have Virginia, you have the European privacy law, you have Brazilian privacy law, you have Korean privacy law. It is very difficult to comply with all the laws. And that's why I would suggest to start with uniform framework that basically talks about the baseline of privacy and what every company should have, no matter which law applies. To which extent that can go into detail, for example, in relation to data subject rights, could be verified later. But for you to understand where you're currently standing, compliance with frameworks like NIST, which I highly recommend. We are using a lot NIST, ISO as well. Specifically, NIST and ISO in relation to privacy are very interesting frameworks that are uniform frameworks. ISO very much focused on GDPR. NIST is very broad and general framework with over 100 controls that can assist you with in relation to implementation of your current privacy posture, so you can see where your gaps are and create a strategy. This is another thing that I didn't mention in this slide, but strategy of how to approach privacy is essential. And this strategy should be based on both the current privacy posture of the company on the basis of, let's say, one of these frameworks, but also on the basis of your business plans in the upcoming year and current market presence. Same applicable for cybersecurity in relation to use of personal information. Both NIST, ISO, and also SOC, they all provide certain current framework of cybersecurity, as NIST also overlaps privacy and cybersecurity in terms of controls to a certain extent. Thank you
so much, Marina. That's a lot of content, but really excellent thoughts there. I just want to pause here and remind the audience that we encourage you to submit questions for any of the speakers. And as you're doing that, we will segue to talk a little bit about some more general regulatory changes, starting with what has become a very hot topic in the investment management industry, and that's ESG. So we'll turn to Sean now. And Sean, can you tell us a little bit about what to consider in terms of ESG oversight?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you everyone for having me. Certainly happy to be here. So this is an area where we are fielding questions almost daily from virtually every type of advisor on the spectrum. So that includes everything from hedge, private equity, wealth managers, crypto, venture, you name it, they're interested and everyone's asking about it. So in many situations, however, most advisors don't even know what they're asking and where to start. They only know that they want to be involved in it in some way, shape, or another. And so while ESG has been around for a number of years, I think the maturation of the US market certainly lags our European counterparts by several years. And we've only really recently seen wholesale adoption of ESG and socially responsible investing principles. So I think in the US, largely driven by investor demand, including everyone from your institutional allocators right down to your millennial retail investors with the Robinhood account. I think advisors are clamoring to position their firms and their strategies accordingly. So the unfortunate side of this is that many of those same managers labeling themselves with this coveted ESG tag fail to properly define their guiding principles and adopt proper protocols to ensure compliance with those investor representations. To frame it in a regulatory perspective, if an advisor makes a false ESG claim, pretty much like anything else, thereby inducing investors to either invest or remain invested in a particular product or strategy, the SEC can bring charges under their under anti-fraud provisions. In effect, it's really no different than being prosecuted for inflated performance numbers. And similarly, there are liability concerns when it comes to investors or clients that are claiming reliance as well. So this is where a subject matter that's rooted in the investment side of the business becomes a compliance issue and thus an area of concern for the staff, which we saw the SEC tout in a risk alert that came out earlier this year. Personally, I doubt that we're going to see a substantive regulation directly governing ESG activities and reporting like we saw the SFDR coming out in Europe, but we know it's going to be a focus under existing rules, and this is a subject matter that is here and here to stay longer term. In my opinion, the biggest problem with ESG compliance relates to the fact that you have a largely numbers-based industry attempting to assign quantitative measures to an inherently qualitative topic. When it comes to it, it comes down to it, advisors really need to put a lot of thought into what ESG means to them, how it translates when applied to their specific portfolios, how they're going to develop and source metrics and analytics, whether that's on a security level or an issuer level, whether that's via insourcing or outsourcing, need to figure out what type of screening tools they have, what type of reporting systems and oversight measures they're going to install. They also need to figure out what type of firm training, right? If you have, the front of the house that's drafting a policy, you need to make sure that the investment professionals are adhering to it and there's proper checks and balances from, your back and middle office to ensure that you are actually being in compliance. So I think that governance mechanism really needs to be thought out at the onset so that you can actually make good on your promises. I think managers also need to be realistic about the limitations unique to either them as a firm or their strategy. So for instance, if you have a private market strategy, you had better be prepared to set up those pipes and do the fundamental research on your portfolio companies and figure out how you're actually reporting and analyzing that data, presenting it to investors or LPs, to again make sure that you're in full adherence with those upfront reps and covenants. If you run a fixed income solution, you need to be mindful that a lot of the traditional data sources for equity managers like a Bloomberg or MSCI don't necessarily have the same coverage for less prominent asset classes, even though the market caps for some of those may be pretty substantial. Similarly, if you are allocating to managers that tout ESG or SRI as the pillars of their investment strategy, there's going to be an obligation that you're conducting diligence on how they're defining ESG and how they're actually adhering and complying to it. So, as part of your fiduciary duty, you're going to have to go that extra step of verification. I don't think that a regulator is just going to allow you to accept, those reps on the face. So really, my takeaway from this slide is to put a lot of thought into how you define ESG, how you're going to implement initial and continuing monitoring of your portfolio, how you're going to foster transparency and reporting to investors, and really, again, how you're going to be able to demonstrate to the SEC when they ask questions that you're living up to those statements and representations.
That's great. And I think there's some sentiment out there that we should expect to see increased examination activity, at least at the SEC, over the next few years. So Can you give us some tips for managing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we move to the next slide, I would say that the first half of 2021 has been what I would consider the most active exam season I've seen in my career. That includes both in terms of the occurrence of exams as well as the expanded scope of the staff's reviews. And I think, the industry sentiment is that this could be an indicator of what's to come over the remaining 3.5 years under the Biden administration. Personally, I'm cautiously optimistic that we won't see a full reversion to the broken windows approach under the Mary Jo White SEC. However, I feel that heightened regulatory scrutiny is an almost certainty at this point. But at the end of the day, weathering an exam unscathed really comes down to one thing, and that's preparation. Obviously this may seem somewhat self-serving since this is our business, but things like mock exams and readiness exercises can be hugely helpful for folks who are either unfamiliar with the audit process or just not in touch with recent trends and hot topics for the SEC. And those can be done either by bringing in outside parties or just availing yourself of all the resources that are available publicly. I'd say that even for those that that know what to expect in broad strokes, going through the mechanics of responding to a request letter, repurposing data into the SEC's preferred formats, sitting through interviews, making sure that you nail the narrative and limit the scope of an inquiry is key. Let alone, if those exercises actually yield substantive compliance issues that would otherwise be identified and brought to your attention by the SEC. It's good to be able to proactively remediate rather than be on the defensive for when the staff walks in your hypothetical door, although on-sites are still not a thing for the foreseeable future. Also, again, make sure that you're informed as to what the staff is focusing on. It's not difficult to understand what the SEC is looking at these days with the publication of their annual priorities list, countless risk alerts, coverage of enforcement actions. In addition to, SEC releases, there's an abundance of content from law firms, consulting firms, and of course, trade groups like the IAA. So everyone should make sure to educate themselves. We know the SEC loves to gather facts about industry responses to new and emerging issues. So it makes sense to get ahead of them. And whether that's, for instance, the disruption caused by Hurricane Sandy a few years ago on the East Coast, the wildfires in California, or I don't know, a global pandemic. We know the SEC is asking questions about your responses and what you've done to bolster things like business continuity and cybersecurity and the like. So, it makes sense to be proactive, put together a narrative, and be able to demonstrate to the SEC that you're doing exactly what you should be. The big thing is that you absolutely do not have to be perfect. And frankly, no one should expect a no findings letter going through an exam, although I think that's actually been more common recently due to some of these limited scope exercises that are increasing in popularity. But the important thing is that you're constantly self-assessing, driving improvement wherever possible. And in many respects, the SEC is looking for that process as much as the end result. So, keep that top of mind.
And related to exams, sometimes, unfortunately, is enforcement. Let me turn to your thoughts on that. But first, another reminder to please send any questions through the chat. We'd love to answer some audience questions.
Yeah, so obviously those tips and tricks for navigating an exam are kind of the threshold recommendation for surviving a more enforcement-centric environment, given that if you make it through an exam without any material findings, you're going to avoid enforcement. But the key here is really avoiding two things. One is recidivism, the other is complacency. On the first point, it's very straightforward. If the SEC found something during a prior exam and you committed to fixing it, make sure it's been done to completion. I'd say making false promises to the staff and failing to make good on them puts you on the fast track of enforcement, even when it doesn't involve investor harm. On the second issue of complacency, I'd say far too often firms fail to recognize that they've fallen behind the market in a given area, which really leaves them exposed, especially when it involves an area that could give rise to investor losses. So, look at your policies, what's in there and why. Just because it was best practice 5 years ago doesn't mean that it still is today. Are there things in there that you're doing that you say you're doing that you're really not doing to its full extent as drafted? Have there been evolutions in your business model that necessitated additional or changes to your policies? Have your policies evolved to adapt to new rules, SEC focus areas, or just rule interpretations? Do you have a testing program in place where you're really self-policing? So think of that in terms of first, second, and third line defense, where you have the person who sits at the primary function, then you have compliance as second, and then a quasi internal audit that oversees that. Also, are you mapping out your risks? Have you reconciled them against your policies? Do you put enough resources into those areas that you consider relatively high risk? And do you know what your peers are doing? The truth is that all firms are benchmarked against similarly situated advisors in terms of size, strategy, and the like. So you never want to appear behind the curve. Then the last thing is, if there's a component of your business model that falls into a regulatory gray area, in air quotes, which for the vast majority of firms, the answer is yes, at least in some regard. Are you constantly revisiting and bolstering your disclosures? The good news for the advisory community is that U.S. securities laws are disclosure based. So if you can add supplementary disclosures in your Form ADV, advisory agreements, fund offering documents, DDQs, even ad hoc investor notifications, I think that can go a long way to insulating yourself from potential scrutiny down the road. And then the last thing I'll say is that, as a general matter, we've seen a convergence of compliance, operations, and finance. So to the extent that you can bolster internal processes in these ancillary yet related functions that weren't historically considered compliance, I think that's also in everyone's best interest. Common ones here are, things like cash controls, valuation, corporate actions, trade reconciliation, right? Those weren't necessarily core compliance, although compliance had to ensure that you had a process in place. Now I think the expectation is that you're going the extra step to verify that others within your organization are actually doing what they're supposed to be.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sean. We have a couple of extra minutes. Christian, Marina, do you have anything else you wanted to add? I haven't seen any questions come in. If not, I think we'll wrap up there. So I'd like to thank Christian Kelly from Xantrion, Marina Teskova from Armanino LLP, and Sean Wilkie from Grayline and GCM Advisory very much for your expertise and taking the time to speak to our members. And a special thank you to Xantrion for sponsoring today's webinar. Have a great day.